The smoke that wasn't there. For 3 long weeks, the skies above the valley of Imberfall Valley had been empty. It was not merely that the clouds drifted undisturbed or that the wind blew clean and cold. It was the absence of something living, something bright and reckless that made the emptiness unbearable. The villagers felt it each time they stepped outside at dawn. They felt it in the stillness that hung above the stone towers and slate rooftops. They felt it in the way children shaded their eyes and searched the horizon out of habit, only to lower their hands slowly, disappointed. There were no spirals of playful smoke rising like lazy question marks into the blue. No tiny streaks of scarlet and gold tumbling clumsily through open air. No shrill, triumphant squeaks that once bounced off the cliffs and returned as delighted echoes. The baby dragons had vanished. They had been a part of the valley's rhythm for as long as anyone could remember, small, fiery bursts of chaos that turned ordinary mornings into spectacles. They were not yet mighty enough to darken the sky or split mountains with flame. They were hatchlings no larger than sheepdogs, all oversized paws and half-formed wings. They chased each other through the air with ungainly determination, often crashing into haystacks, chimneys, and occasionally one another. They were trouble. They were wonders. They were lives. And now they were gones. At first, the elders of the village dismissed the absence as coincidence. Wind currents, they said. The hatchlings had likely followed a warmer stream of air farther east. Dragons, even young ones, were creatures of instinct and whim. They would return when the mood suited them. But a week passed, then another, and the sky remained heartbreakingly clear. The elders' explanations shifted. Perhaps poachers had crept into the valley under cover of night. Dragon scales, even shed ones, were worth fortunes in distant cities. Dragon bone could anchor enchantments. Dragon blood, well, the less said about that, the better. Then, in hushed tones behind closed doors, the elders began to blame themselves. Baby dragons were not merely animals. They were living furnaces of wild magic, born of the ancient broodmother Ashara, last daughter of the legendary line of Ignivar the World Burner. Their lineage stretched back through centuries of ash and empire, through wars that had reshaped continents and infernos that had carved rivers. The people of Imberfall had always walked a careful line with dragonkind, offering tribute when necessary, maintaining respectful distance, and above all ensuring that the hatchlings were never harmed. But had they watched too closely, had their caution curdled into pressure, had their whispered fears of what they might become reached sensitive young ears? Such questions gnawed at the village like winter rats in grain stores. Search parties were formed. Hunters scaled the basalt cliffs where the dragons liked to sun themselves. Shepherds combed the hills, scanning for scorched earth or glimmering scales caught on brambles. Even the aging scholars of the Order of Cinders unsealed scrolls that had not tasted air in decades. They traced faded diagrams of draconic migration patterns. They debated lunar cycles and ley lines. They burned incense that smelled of old smoke and desperation. Nothing. No tracks in the dust. No blackened craters in the meadow. No molten footprints pressed into stone. The valley was intact. Too intact. Dragons, even infants, left marks on the world. That was their nature. Fire transformed everything it touched, and yet it was as though the hatchlings had dissolved into mist. As the third week waned, a quiet dread settled over Imberfall. Without the dragon's warmth, the morning seemed colder. Frost lingered longer on wheat stalks. The air felt thinner, brittle. Some claimed the valley itself was grieving. Far beyond the anxious village center, past the terraced fields and grazing sheep, stood a weather-beaten barn at the edge of a modest barley farm. Its roof sagged slightly at one corner. Its doors bore the scratches of generations of livestock pushing impatiently at feeding time. The paint, if it had ever truly been paint, had long ago surrendered to sun and rain. The barn belonged to Halric Duns. Halric was not a man of legend. He was neither knight nor mage, neither scholar nor warrior. His hands were thick with calluses, his boots perpetually dusted with soil. His greatest triumph in recent memory had been coaxing a stubborn mule to accept a new harness. His greatest worry was whether the autumn frost would arrive early enough to ruin the late barley. He had watched the baby dragons like everyone else. He had grumbled when one singed the top of his scarecrow. He had shaken his fist half-heartedly when a stray spark blackened a fence post. But secretly, like most in the valley, he had found their presence comforting. Their wild arcs through the sky were proof that the world still held magic beyond the grind of plow and harvest. When they vanished, Halric noticed the silence, but he did not join the search parties. Crops did not harvest themselves, and sheep did not wait for existential crises to be resolved. Still, on quiet evenings, he found himself glancing upward. On the 23rd night of the dragon's disappearance, Halric was finishing his rounds when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of tired eyes, a shimmer at the edge of his vision. The sun had long since dipped below the western ridge, and dusk painted the valley in muted blues. But there it was again, a faint red glow leaking through the slats of his barn. Halric stopped mid-step. The glow pulsed softly, not the wild flicker of open flame but something steadier, rhythmic. His stomach dropped. Hey? The entire loft was stacked high with it, dry, golden, eager to ignite at the slightest provocation. One stray ember from a lantern, one careless spark. Of all the rotten lucks, he muttered. He broke into a run, boots thudding against packed earth. The air smelled faintly warm but not yet of smoke. He seized a water bucket from beside the well, sloshing half its contents onto his trousers in his haste. By the time he reached the barn doors, the glow had intensified. It painted the wood in deep crimson streaks as though the structure were bleeding light. Halric braced himself. If the hay was ablaze, he would have minutes at best before the entire building caught. The sheep penned nearby would panic. The fire might leap to the fields, weeks of labor gone. He kicked the barn doors open with a shout. The hinges screeched in protest. Cold night air rushed inside. And Halric froze. The hay was not burning. It was breathing. At the center of the loft, where the largest mound of straw had been stacked, something rose and fell in gentle unison. The red glow emanated from within that heap like banked embers beneath ash. Halric's eyes adjusted slowly. Straw shifted. A small scaled tail flicked lazily into view. Then a wing half unfurled, caught the light and shimmered with gold-edged crimson. There were 6 of them. 6 baby dragons, curled together in a tight, tangled pile as though the entire loft were a nest built solely for their comfort. Their bodies overlapped in an intricate mosaic of scales, scarlet, copper, molten amber. Their chests expanded and contracted in synchronized rhythm, each exhale releasing a tiny puff of smoke that drifted upward and vanished among the rafters. The glow Halric had seen was their warmth, soft, steady, contained. One lay sprawled on its back, claws twitching as if chasing something in a dream. Another had buried its snout deep into the straw, producing a faint, rumbling snore. A third clutched something wooden against its chest. Halric squinted. It was his pitchfork. The dragon held it possessively, one talon hooked through the handle like a child gripping a favored toy. For several long seconds, Halric simply stood there, water bucket dangling uselessly from his hand. His mind attempted to assemble reasonable explanations and failed. The entire valley had searched for these creatures, scholars had invoked ancient names, hunters had scoured cliffs. And the dragons had been here. In his barn. Sleeping. A soft sound broke the stillness. One of the dragons stirred. Its eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes like molten coin, bright, reflective, intelligent. It blinked up at Halric without alarm, without aggression. It yawned. The yawn revealed small, curved fangs and a tongue that glowed faintly at the edges. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from its mouth as it stretched its neck. Halric instinctively tensed. The dragon regarded him for a moment. Then, with all the solemn dignity of a creature far older than its size suggested, it pushed itself upright, stumbled down the straw mound, and waddled toward him. Each step left a faint warmth in the wood beneath its paws, but no scorch marks. It stopped just short of his boots, tilted its head, and pressed its forehead gently against his shin. The contact was warm, not painfully so, but like standing near a hearth in winter, a steady, reassuring heat. Halric stared down at the creature. It made a soft churring noise, not a roar, not a hiss. A greetings. Behind it, the others shifted but did not rise. They trusted the first to investigate. Halric swallowed. He had expected flame. He had expected destruction. Instead, he found himself the subject of quiet appraisal by a dragon hatchling that seemed more curious than dangerous. Slowly, very slowly, he set the water bucket aside. Well, he murmured, his voice rough with disbelief, this complicates things. The dragon blinked again as if agreeing. Behind it, another rolled over and mumbled in its sleep, tightening its grip on the pitchfork. Halric let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The barn remained intact. The hay was warm but unburned. The sheep outside had not panicked. In fact, they were unusually calm, as though soothed by an unseen presence. 6 baby dragons had vanished from the valley. And somehow, for reasons beyond logic or prophecy, they had chosen his barn as their refuge. Halric Dunn, whose ambitions extended no further than a successful harvest, and perhaps a new pair of boots before winter, now stood guardian to the most sought-after creatures in Imberfall. He looked at the nearest hatchling, which was now attempting to chew experimentally on the hem of his trousers. "You're not eating the sheep," he said firmly. The dragon paused, considered him, and released the fabric. Halric nodded once, as though an agreement had been struck. Outside, the valley lay silent beneath starlight, unaware that its missing fire slept peacefully in a humble wooden barn. And within that barn, amid straw and old timber and the steady breathing of 6 tiny furnaces, something shifted in the quiet fabric of the world. The dragons had not been stolen. They had not fled in fear. They had simply gone where they were not watched with expectation. They had found warmth without pressure. They had chosen stillness over spectacle. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the valley's lost fire rested, not in cliffs or towers, but in the care of a man who had only meant to save his hay from burning. The quiet guardians. Halric did not inform the village. Not at first. He told himself it was practicality. The barley still needed thrashing, the sheep still needed tending, and if he ran down into the square shouting about 6 missing dragon hatchlings asleep in his loft, the result would not be calm gratitude. It would be chaos, spears, torches, the kind of attention that turned accidents into disasters. But if he were honest with himself, and Halric Dunn was not a man given to elaborate self-deception, there was another reason. When one of the dragons stirred at the sound of his voice that first night, it had not bared its teeth. It had not flared its wings or arched its back in challenge. It had yawned. The sound had been absurdly small for a creature of such lineage, a tiny, squeaking rumble that ended in a faint puff of smoke. Then it had waddled forward on unsteady paws, claws clicking softly against the wooden floor, and pressed its warm, scaly forehead against his boot. That simple gesture had undone weeks of fear. There had been no threat in it, no display of dominance, just contact. Trust. That was when Halric understood something the scholars had missed, something the elders had overlooked in their endless discussions of bloodlines and prophecy. The dragons had not fled. They had chosen. The first morning after their discovery, Halric rose before dawn out of habit. For a moment, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, convinced he had dreamed the entire encounter. 6 dragons in his barn was the sort of thing that happened to bards and fools, not barley farmers. Then he smelled it. Not smoke, at least not the choking kind. It was a warm mineral scent like heated stone after summer rain, subtle, comforting. He dressed quickly and stepped outside. A faint mist clung to the fields. Frost should have crusted the ground, the air had turned sharp in recent days, and Halric had gone to sleep worrying about his late crop. Instead, as he walked barefoot through the first rows of barley, he felt warmth beneath his soles. Not hot. Alive. He knelt and pressed his palm to the soil. It was gently heated, as though the earth itself were breathing out a slow, steady sigh. Halric looked toward the barns. A thin ribbon of smoke curled lazily from a crack in the loft boards, pale and harmless against the lightning sky. He exhaled. Well, he muttered, either I've lost my senses or I've gained 6 furnace spirits. Inside the barn, the dragons were awake. They were not rampaging. They were not testing their flames against beams or chewing through fence posts. They were exploring. One had discovered a stack of old harnesses and was nosing through leather straps with delicate curiosity. Another was attempting to balance atop a feed barrel, wings extended for stability. 2 more were engaged in a slow, clumsy wrestling match in the straw, their growls more indignant than fierce. The one who had greeted him the night before looked up as he entered. It chirped. Halric hesitated at the threshold. He had dealt with livestock all his life. He understood the importance of tone, posture, presence. Animals sensed fear. They also sensed authority. He stepped fully inside and shut the doors behind him. Right, he said aloud, folding his arms. We're going to set some boundaries. 6 pairs of bright eyes fixed on him. You don't burn the barn, he continued. You don't eat the sheep, and you don't torch the fields, agreed. There was a pause. Then one of the smaller hatchlings sneezed. A spark leapt from its nostrils and struck a rafter. Halric flinched. Before he could react, another dragon slightly larger, scales deeper red bounded forward. It opened its mouth and released a precise puff of steam that enveloped the spark and smothered it instantly. The wood smoked faintly, then cooled. The two dragons exchanged a look that Halric could only interpret as mild embarrassment and correction. Halric stared. You put it out. The larger hatchling glanced at him, then nudged the smaller one sharply with its snout. The message was unmistakable. Careful. Halric felt something shift inside his chest, not fear, not awe. Respect. Over the following days, he observed them carefully. He did not trust easily, not with creatures capable of melting iron, but neither did he assume catastrophe. He went about his chores as usual, watching from the corner of his eye as they moved through the barn. They were deliberate. Strangely so. When one grew too excited and its tail brushed against a stack of dry straw, another would tug it away. When a playful snap of jaws threatened to scorch wood, a companion would intercede with a firm nudge or a low warning trill. They policed one another. There was intelligence in their restraint. By the third day, Halric realized something else. They were helping. It began subtly. The frost that had crept steadily closer to his field stopped at an invisible boundary. Neighboring farms woke to white-crusted rows and brittle leaves. Halric's barley stood green and resilient, warmed from beneath by a gentle, consistent heat. He tested it one morning before sunrise, walking the perimeter of his land. At the edge of his property, the soil grew cool and stiff. 2 steps inward, it softened again, pliant and rich. The dragons had drawn a line. They spent their days wandering the boundaries of the farm, sometimes in pairs, sometimes singly. They did not stray beyond the fence. When Halric opened the gate for the sheep, they followed at a distance, watching. The wolves noticed. For weeks before the dragon's arrival, a small pack had prowled the tree line, testing the edges of his flock. Halric had lost 2 lambs earlier that season and had taken to sleeping lightly, crossbow within reach. On the 4th night, he heard the wolves howl. It was a different sound. Not hungry. Fearful. He stepped outside with a lantern. Along the far fence, 6 small silhouettes stood in a line. Their wings were partially unfurled, their bodies glowing brighter than he had yet seen. The air shimmered around them, heat bending the night. Across the field at the edge of the woods, the wolves retreated. No flame was unleashed, no roaring display split the silence. The dragons simply stood. Guarding. Halric lowered his lantern slowly. You're serious about this, aren't you? He murmured. One of the hatchlings glanced back at him, eyes reflecting gold in the dark. The orchard changed next. Halric had always struggled with the older apple trees at the north end of his property. The soil there was thin, stubborn, fruit came small and sour more often than not. A week after the dragons settled in, he noticed the leaves deepening in color. The bark seemed healthier, less brittle. When he dug a small trench near the roots, he found the earth darker than before, loamy and warm, threaded with faint veins of reddish mineral he did not recognize. He glanced up. 2 dragons were perched carefully among the branches, tails wrapped securely to avoid snapping limbs. They exhaled softly, not fire, but heat into the canopy. The leaves rustled gently in response. The next harvest from those trees was the sweetest Halric had ever tasted. Wordless gratitude settled between farmer and dragon. Each night they returned to their hay nest. No matter where they roamed during the day, fields, orchard, fence line, they gathered in the loft after sunset. They piled atop one another in a familiar, tangled mass of scales and wings. Their collective warmth filled the barn with steady radiance, turning it into a sanctuary against the creeping chill. Halric often lingered by the door before retiring to his cottage. He would watch their breathing slow, smoke rising in synchronized curls. Sometimes one would twitch in sleep, emitting a faint chirp that sounded suspiciously like contentment. They trusted him enough to sleep deeply. That knowledge humbled him more than any bow from a noble might have. The valley elders, had they known, would have spoken of destiny. They would have consulted the Order of Cinders and unearthed some half-burned prophecy about bonds between man and dragon forged in forgotten ages. But Halric saw something simpler. The baby dragons had been born into a world that feared what they would become. He remembered the way villagers used to watch them, measuring the size of their flames, whispering about the day their wings would darken the sun. Even praise had been laced with caution. Magnificent, they would say. Dangerous, they would add. Children learned early that dragons were wonders to admire from a safe distance. The hatchlings had never been allowed to simply exist. Every spark they released was scrutinized. Every playful crash interpreted as an omen. The valley loved them, but it loved them warily. Halric did not measure their flames. He did not speculate about their future size or strength. He expected only three things. Do not burn the barns. Do not eat the sheep. Do not ruin the barleys. Everything beyond that was negotiable. Perhaps that was why they had wandered here. Not in angers, not in rebellions, but in quiet search of a place where they were not symbols. Somewhere warm, somewhere unobserved, somewhere no one flinched at every flicker of light. They had found a barn with crooked beams and uneven floors. They had found a farmer whose concerns were immediate and practical. And they had chosen to stay. One afternoon, as Halric repaired a fence post, a shadow fell across his work. He looked up. All six dragons stood behind him in a loose semicircle, watching intently. One tilted its head as he hammered a nail. Another crept closer, fascinated by the rhythm of the strikes. Halric paused and held out the hammer. "Go on then," he said dryly. "If you're going to supervise, you might as well learn." The nearest dragon extended a cautious claw and tapped the wood experimentally. Its touch left a faint warmth but did not char the grain. Halric chuckled despite himself. "You lot are something else." The dragon's tail swished, stirring dust into lazy spirals. He realized then that the barn no longer felt like his alone. It felt shared, protected, alive in a way it had never been before. Nights grew colder across the valley, frost thickened on neighboring roofs. Smoke rose constantly from chimneys as families burned through dwindling wood supplies. On Halric's farm, the barn glowed gently after dusk. Not a beacon, nothing so obvious, but a steady warmth that seeped into beams and earth alike. Travelers passing along the distant road sometimes paused, frowning at the unusual clarity of the air above his land. There was no heavy smoke plume, no roaring inferno. Just the quiet persistence of heat. Inside, six baby dragons slept soundly. And outside, wolves kept their distance. Frost turned aside, apples ripened fuller than before. The dragons had not fled the valley in fear. They had not abandoned their birthplace. They had simply chosen a guardian who did not expect them to burn the world. And in return, they guarded him. Not with spectacle, not with destruction, but with careful, deliberate warmth. Halric Dunn never knelt before ancient broodmothers or swore oaths beneath blazing skis. He did not speak the language of prophecy. He spoke the language of fences mended, fields tended, animals fed. And somehow that was enough. The baby dragons had sought quiet. They had found it in weathered wood and straw. They had sought warmth without scrutiny. They had found it in a man who judged them not by the infernos they might one day command, but by whether they kept his sheep safe through the night. Which to their unwavering credit they did. The meaning of fire. The discovery could not remain secret forever. Secrets, Halric reflected bitterly, were like embers buried in straw. They seemed harmless at first, small, contained, easily ignored. But given enough time, enough wind, they revealed themselves in smoke. It was smoke that betrayed them. Not the violent plume of a raging inferno, not the black, choking cloud of disaster. What rose from Halric Dunn's farm on the coldest morning of winter was something steadier, thinner, almost gentle. Columns of pale gray drifting upward from his fields in measured spirals. Smoke that meant warmth. Smoke that meant life. The frost that strangled the rest of the valley had descended hard that week. Roofs glittered white beneath a merciless sky. Wells froze at their rims. Livestock huddled miserably against biting winds. Men cursed the season and fed their hearths with dwindling stacks of wood. But Halric's land stood apart. His wheat shimmered gold instead of silver. His orchard leaves held fast instead of curling inward. The snow that blanketed neighboring farms melted into harmless slush at the boundaries of his fence, as though some invisible hearth lay buried beneath the soil. Travelers noticed. Farmers noticed. And on that bitter morning, when the sun hung pale and weak above the horizon, the villagers gathered. They did not come empty-handed. Spears gleamed in gloved fists. Crossbows were slung across thick woolen shoulders. The elders walked at the front, faces stern with a mixture of fear and wounded pride. Behind them marched younger men eager to prove courage, and mothers clutching children close as though fire itself might leap from the fields. Halric saw them from the fence line. He had expected this day. He set down the grain sack he had been carrying and wiped his hands slowly on his trousers. The air was sharp in his lungs, but warmth radiated upward from the earth beneath his boots. Behind him, the barn door stood closed. He could feel them inside. 6 small furnaces humming softly in the loft. Halric walked to the gate and planted himself before it, pitchfork in hand. Not raised. Not lowered. Simply held. The villagers stopped several paces away, snow crunched beneath boots, breath fogged in the frigid air. Elder Mavrin stepped forward, his beard stiff with frost. Halric Dunn, he called, voice edged with strain, explain this. Halric followed the elder's gaze toward his fields. They're growing, he replied evenly. In winter. Oh yes. A murmur rippled through the crowd. We searched 3 weeks for those hatchlings, Mavrin continued. 3 weeks, and now smoke rises from your land while the rest of us freeze. Halric's jaw tightened. I didn't steal them. Then where are they? Before Halric could answer, the barn doors creaked open behind him. The sound cut through the murmurs like a blade. Every head turned. The first dragon emerged cautiously, claws tapping against wood. Its scales glowed faintly in the winter light like banked embers beneath ash. It paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring as it assessed the gathered crowd. Then another joined it. And another. 6 small dragons shuffled into view, wings tucked close against the cold air. Their tails traced delicate lines in the snow as they descended the short ramp to the yard. They did not roar. They did not flare their wings in threat. They walked past Halric, and they sat beside him. One leaned its warm flank against his leg, as though he were nothing more remarkable than a fence post. Another bounded lightly onto the barn roof, settling there with careful precision. 2 positioned themselves near the gate, not aggressively but attentively. Guardians. The villagers hesitated. Spears wavered. These were not towering beasts of legend. Not yet. They were smaller than calves, their horns barely curved, their wings still edged with youthful translucence. Their eyes, bright gold, copper, molten amber, held curiosity rather than fury. One tilted its head at a child peeking from behind her mother's skirts. Another pawed experimentally at a clump of snow, watching it melt beneath gentle heat. They're calm, someone whispered. Halric kept his gaze forward. They've been here, he said quietly. They chose to stay. You expect us to believe that? A younger man snapped, knuckles white around his spear shaft. Dragons don't choose barns. These ones did. As if in affirmation, the dragon at Halric's side pressed its forehead briefly against his thigh. The gesture rippled through the crowd like a thrown stone across ice. They haven't burned anything, Halric continued. They haven't touched the sheep, they've kept wolves from the fence, and they've warmed the fields enough to survive this cold. Mavrin's eyes flicked toward the golden wheat beyond the fence. You hid them. I protected them. From us. Halric did not answer. He did not need to. The truth hung in the air like frost. A sudden shadow swept across the snow. It moved too vast, too swift to belong to cloud or hawk. Every dragon in the yard lifted its head simultaneously. They chirped. Not in alarms. In recognition. The wind changed. It came first as a tremor in the air, a pressure building above, bending currents into spirals. Snow lifted in tiny eddies across the fields. The sky darkened not with storm but with wings. Then she descended. Ashara, broodmother of the valley, last daughter of the line of Ignivar the world burner. Her wings blotted out the pale sun. Each beat sent shockwaves through the air, scattering snow like flung sparks. Her scales glowed with the intensity of molten iron, deep crimson shot through with veins of living gold. When she landed beyond the fence, the earth trembled. Snow vaporized beneath her talons. The villagers stumbled backward as one. Spears clattered. A collective gasp rose from human throats. Ashara towered above them, vast and ancient, smoke coiling from her nostrils in thick rolling clouds. Her horns curved like scythes. Her eyes burned brighter than any forge. Halric did not run. His heart thundered in his chest, but his boots remained planted in the warmed earth. The baby dragons did not flee. They chirped again, higher now, eager. One bounded forward a step before Halric instinctively placed a steadying hand on its back. Izzy, he murmured. Ashara's gaze swept across the yard. It lingered first on her children. They stood strong, uninjured, scales glossy and well-fed. Their wings were intact, their movements unrestrained. Alive, Safe. Her massive head lowered. The motion alone stirred wind powerful enough to bend wheat stalks flat. Her eyes settled on Halric Dunn. There was no immediate flame. No roar. Only scrutiny. It felt as though centuries weighed behind that gaze. Wars remembered, betrayals etched in fire, alliances forged and broken. She saw the unburned barn. She saw the untouched sheep grazing calmly beyond the fence. She saw the orchard thriving in winter's grip. She saw her children lining not away from the human but toward him. The dragon on the roof shifted slightly, wings adjusting to maintain balance. Another nudged Halric's knee gently. Ashara inhaled. The sound was deep, cavernous, resonant enough to vibrate bone. Halric swallowed but did not look away. I didn't chain them, he said softly, though he knew she understood far more than words. I didn't cage them, they stayed because they wanted to. The wind died. Snow settled. For a long moment, the world held its breath. The villagers stood frozen, caught between terror and awe. Ashara's eyes flicked once more across the fields. Then something no prophecy had foreseen occurred. She bowed her head. Not deeply, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. A gesture measured and deliberate. A recognition of stewardship freely given and freely respected. The gasp that tore from the villagers was louder than any roar. Halric felt warmth flood his chest that had nothing to do with dragonfire. Ashara extended one immense wing, curving it protectively around her brood. The hatchlings chirped excitedly, pressing closer to her shadow but not abandoning their places beside Halric. They did not scatter in fear of her power. They did not scramble behind her legs. They remained, balanced between dragon and man. Ashara's gaze softened, if such a word could apply to something forged of flame. She understood. Humanity had always believed dragons to be forces of destruction, living weapons, natural disasters with wings. Perhaps they were not wrong. Fire consumed. Fire transformed. Fire ended. But fire also forged steel, hardened clay, cleared rot from forest floors to make way for new growth. In the wrong hands, it devoured. In the right hands, it sustained. Here, in a humble wooden barn at the edge of a winter-stricken valley, that truth stood embodied in golden wheat and unscorched beams. Halric had not tried to command her children. He had not sought to harness their flame for conquest or glory. He had simply given them space. Expectation without fear. Boundaries without chains. In return, they had chosen to protect rather than destroy. Ashara lifted her head slowly. Snow slid from her horns in glittering cascades. Her wings unfurled. The motion was vast and terrible and beautiful. With a single powerful beat, she rose into the air. Wind roared outward, flattening cloaks and stirring embers in unseen hearths across the valley. The hatchlings watched her ascend, necks craned high. Then she was a shadow against the winter sky. Then a distant streak of crimson. Then gone. Silence fell. Gradually, the villagers lowered their weapons. Spears dipped toward the snow. Crossbows slackened. No one spoke at first. They simply stared at Halric and at the 6 dragons still arrayed calmly around him. One of the smallest hatchlings approached the gate and sniffed experimentally at Mavrin's boot. The elder flinched but did not retreat. The dragon huffed a small, warm puff of air against the leather, melting frost instantly. Mavrin looked down, then back at Halric. They guard you, he said quietly. Halric shrugged. And I guard them. A child broke free from her mother's grip and stepped cautiously forward. The dragon by the gate tilted its head, curious. The girl extended a mittened hand. The dragon sniffed it, then leaned gently into her palm. Laughter, nervous, disbelieving, rose from the crowd. Something fragile shifted in that moment. Fear cracked. Understanding seeped through. They could have burned us all, the young spearman murmured. They still could, Halric replied evenly. The truth hung between them. Power did not vanish simply because it was restrained. It was choice that mattered. Choice. The dragons had vanished for weeks. The valley had assumed loss. The truth was simpler. They had been waiting. waiting for humanity to decide what it would be in the presence of fire. Dominators, or partners. As the villagers slowly dispersed, all replacing suspicion, Halric felt a familiar weight press against his leg. The first hatchling, the one who had greeted him that very first night, looked up with bright molten eyes. Halric crouched and scratched gently behind its small, curved horns. It purred. The sound vibrated like a forge humming at steady heat. Above them, the winter sun struggled through thin cloud. Yet on Halric Dunn's farm, warmth endured. Not because dragons had chosen to burn, but because they and one stubborn farmer had chosen not to.